talk is based on a paper that I have written with my co-author Rebecca Jackson, and which came out in a volume of work earlier this year. The title is When Everything Stands Out, Nothing Does, Typography, Expectations and Procedures, and today I'm going to focus really on the typography and expectations part of that work. Whenever we produce a spoken utterance, we make decisions about how that utterance will sound. So we make decisions about which syllables we will stress, where we will place the main accent, what tone and pitch we will use when we produce the utterance. These prosodic qualities of a spoken utterance are what we call suprasegmental. That is, they layer on top of the segments of an utterance. So the same sequence of words, the segments might not change, but they can be produced in various different ways by layering on different intonational and prosodic patterns. And we have quite strong intuitions about how changing the stress patterns, the intonation patterns, can change the meaning. So there's a difference, I think we'd all agree, between I really like this book and I really like this book, and I really like this book, and I really like this book, and we could go on playing with the intonation in that way. Likewise, when we produce a written utterance, whether that's handwritten or digital, we make decisions about how that utterance will look on the page. What typeface and font we will use, we think about how big the letter forms will be, whether we're going to capitalise any of the letter forms, use italics, boldface, underlining, perhaps colour. And just as a spoken utterance can't be produced without prosody, without intonation and rhythm of some sort, so a written utterance cannot be produced without a physical representation, typography of some sort. And in this talk, I'm going to consider some of the ways in which typographical decisions in written utterances interact with and contribute to meaning. And I'm going to use ideas from a cognitive framework for understanding utterance interpretation in order to do this. And that framework is called Relevance Theory. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that today, so I hope this talk will be accessible to people who aren't familiar with that theory. And hopefully the title of the theory will make sense as we go through. So I'm going to start by going over a few of the kind of theoretical claims that we've made, and then I'm just going to spend some time looking at some different examples so we can see how that plays out in actual attested examples out there in the world. So, to start off with, various people, both linguists and typographers, have noticed that typography interacts with meaning. So the linguist David Crystal notes that it is possible for us to use typographical features to change the linguistic meaning of what we write. And with a point that I'm going to be expanding on later, Typography notes that if an author consciously disturbs typographical conventions, we must assume it is meaningful. So there's this link between disturbing a typographical convention and creating some kind of meaning from that disturbance. And I'm going to be thinking particularly about the implications of this idea of consciously disrupting something and that leading to particular or extra meaning being created in some way. So let's consider a few examples to illustrate the sort of thing that I mean. So first, it's important to say that in the paper and in this talk, I've limited the discussion to the consideration of some intrinsic features of letter forms. So, for example, bolding, italics, underlining, and so on. There is a lot more to be said about extrinsic typographical elements, such as space, arrangement on a page, that kind of thing. I have also, for now, abstracted away from use of colour, different fonts, and so on. But this is something that I want to return to in the future. But just keeping it simple for now, just to give us a kind of a sample of the sort of things that we can gain by bringing a cognitive and communicative theory and applying it to these written examples of text. So consider the role that putting something in italics plays in the following examples. So the first example is a constructed example, Andrew through to Patrick, and then he in italics through to Matthew. And what's key to understand here is that by changing that pronoun he into italics, we change the way that reference is resolved. We change what that word he refers to. And this parallels the effect that we would achieve when we speak this by putting an extra stress on that pronoun. So without the italics and without the stress, he would be taken to refer to Andrew, but with it, we take that pronoun to refer either to Patrick or perhaps to some other salient male who's in the discourse context. And in this case, that change in representation of the word on the page changes the truth-evaluable meaning of the utterance. So when it's not in italics, this utterance is true when Andrew through to Patrick and then Andrew through to Matthew. But when it's in italics, it's true when Andrew through to Patrick and then Patrick or somebody else through to Matthew. So these utterances, with or without italics, are true in different contexts, in different situations. They describe different events happening in the world. A different use of italics in 2, so this is an extract from Silas Marner. Here, italics are used to present a Latin term in an English text. And here, we don't find the same effect. It doesn't change the meaning, but rather the writer is following a convention. And then we have examples 3 and 4, where the use of italics highlights a particular part of the utterance, creating a sense of contrast and emphasis. So 3 is from The Great Gatsby, where one of the characters says, "Oh, you're Jordan Baker." And what we have here is drawing attention to a particular part of the name for contrastive and emphatic effect. So full names are usually accented on the surname, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Kamala Harris, and so on. We normally have the main accent in a full name on the surname. So here the written representation of the name is standing in for the shift of that stress in the spoken version of the utterance onto the first name here to create a contrastive effect. And it creates that effect because we're not expecting it. We're expecting the name to be said Jordan Baker, but here it's pronounced Jordan Baker, and our attention is focused on that first name, and we get some kind of contrastive effect along the lines of, "Oh, you're Jordan Baker and not somebody else Baker that perhaps I thought you were." The example in 4 is from American Psycho, and here the italics draw attention again to a particular part of the utterance and mark emphasis. Again, we would imagine this being mirrored in the intonation patterns if this utterance were to be spoken or read aloud. And in this case, there seems to be something about the speaker or the narrator's attitude or emotions that's being conveyed. His anger or his frustration is being conveyed by the use of italics here. So we can see the use of italics leading to various different effects in these different examples. So it's clearly not the case that italics always mean the same thing. And in this paper, I really begin from the assumption that the typographical choices that are made by writers are not random, but they're driven by communicative intentions, and more specifically, by intentions of relevance, of making the utterance worth the reader's while to process and giving them enough effects to make it worth their while engaging with reading and processing. I consider the interaction that these choices that the writers make have with the meanings that are conveyed by the utterance. So we're going to focus in here particularly on this sense of emphasis that can be associated with italicizing or capitalizing the letter form in a way that is disruptive in some way. So to think about this in a little bit more detail, I want to briefly consider the 4 examples that are on the screen now. The sentence "Jenny teaches violin" represented with different capitalization pattern. The thing to note here is that in each of these utterances, the truth conditional meaning stays the same. So in each case, these sentences are true if and only if Jenny teaches violin. However, in examples 6, 7 and 8, the reader is encouraged to infer that there is some relevant contrast to be drawn between the described state of affairs and perhaps another possible state of affairs that perhaps was more expected. So, for example, in 6, the reader is encouraged to search for relevance, for meaning in the fact that Jenny, and not somebody else, teaches violin. Now, it seems clear on one level from these examples that there is a connection between the stress patterns in a spoken utterance and the written representation of the utterance. But it's also interesting that there are differences as well. These aren't exactly parallel. So each of these examples here represents one intonational phrase. So Jenny teaches violin is one intonational phrase. And when spoken, each intonational phrase has one, what we call nuclear accent, kind of one focal point that stands out as the main accent if we kind of talk in non-technical terms. The unmarked intonation pattern, the one that we are expecting, is represented by the written version in 5. Jenny teaches violin. Now, it's not that there is no accent in this example. There is an accent. The accent is on violin. It's just that the accent is in an unmarked position. It's where we would expect it to be if everything else is normal and all the information in this sentence is new. Because in that situation, the accent falls on the last content word of the phrase. That is the expected pattern in English. That's what English speakers and hearers are expecting to hear. As 5 follows an expected prosodic pattern, it's not indicated in the typography at all. We don't indicate stresses in the written form of language unless they deviate from what we are expecting in some way. There's also something interesting to say about example 8. If we want to create a contrastive effect around the word violin, Jenny teaches violin, then it's already got an accent, the word violin, in the unmarked version of this sentence. So the hearer is expecting the word violin to have an accent, all else being equal. So if we want to create a contrastive effect around the word violin, so Jenny teaches violin and not cello, for example, then we have to layer another layer of emphasis on top. So we have to use a wider pitch range when we say it, or we have to make it slightly louder, or we have to make it more emphatic in some way to draw a special attention to the word violin. So it's not that stress necessarily creates extra effects if it's expected, and it's not necessarily that the nuclear accent of a phrase necessarily draws our attention in this kind of contrastive way. It only does so if it disrupts what we're expecting. And when our expectations are disrupted or disconfirmed, we look for some meaning in that, as we saw in the captured in the quotation a couple of slides ago. So to sum this up, these are the following claims. Typography and expectations. An unexpected typographical representation, much like an unexpected prosodic pattern triggers a search for extra effects. That's the relevance theoretic words for extra meaning, really. The typography naturally highlights where the reader should find those effects. So we don't disrupt the typography in a random way. We disrupt it in a way that draws attention to a particular part of the utterance, and we look for some kind of meaning related to that part of the utterance. A little bit more around this idea of expectations, more generally, and the role that expectations play in our reactions in other parts of our kind of cognitive and communicative existence. So the role that expectations play in our reaction to music has been explored by Huron, and as he explains, expectation is a constant part of mental life. A cook expects a broth to taste a certain way. A pedestrian expects traffic to move when the light turns green. If my text were abruptly to change topic, or if the prose suddenly switched to a foreign language, you would probably be dismayed. Nor do the changes need to be dramatic in order to have an effect. So here he's talking about this kind of reaction we have when things are disrupted and our expectations are disconfirmed or disappointed. And really this work within relevance theory builds on this work from Huron, but takes a slightly different angle. It's maybe not quite so pessimistic. Relevance theory predicts that rather than simply being dismayed when things are disrupted or our expectations are not met, the hearer or the reader will look for some reason behind that disruption, some extra meaning that kind of makes the disruption worthwhile. In relevance theory terms, we say that they assume optimal relevance and they seek cognitive effects which justify the extra effort that has been inherent in processing something unexpected. Another thing to consider is why these variations in typography have this highlighting effect. It certainly seems to be not coincidental that these devices that are used in typography, these natural highlighting devices, underlining, capitalization, bolding, that kind of thing, tend to make the text bigger, darker, or more salient in some way. It's not by pure chance that, as David Crystal says, capitalization is used to convey loudness and special significance. There is a natural link between size and how likely something is to be relevant. If I shout at you, you're going to pay attention and expect to find relevance in what I'm saying. We have a natural tendency to pay attention to loud noises and bright lights because they are likely to be relevant to us, both in a kind of layperson's understanding of relevant and in this technical sense of relevance that is used within this theory. But this can't be the whole story. We don't, for example, pay attention to particularly bright lights in a nightclub where there's lots of bright lights. And we don't pay attention to any one bang during a fireworks display, for example. And in fact, in those situations, darkness and silence can be used to create effects. So when everything is noisy, silence is the thing that can draw our attention. It's not the light or the noise necessarily that draws our attention. It's a disruption and it's something that is unexpected. So while often the way to disrupt and draw attention is to go big and bright and loud, it's not necessarily the whole story to achieving this. Language, culture, and specific conventions also play a really important role in this. When we're playing with expectations, those expectations can come from a culture, they can be language specific, they can be genre specific, or they can relate to conventions. So, for example, we don't pay extra attention to initial capitalization when it's at the start of a sentence in English. We're expecting that. It's a convention that we italicize the first word in a sentence. Neither do we pay any particular attention to, let's say, a newspaper headline that is larger and bolder than the main body text below, other than to identify it as a headline. We don't expect anything extra to follow from the italicization of the Latin terms in the example that I showed earlier. We just accepted that it's a convention of how Latin terms are represented. So central to the approach that we're taking here is the claim that while, for example, uppercase letters are larger than their lowercase cousins, it's only when they deviate from conventions that we go looking for some meaning in that, in the fact that they are represented as uppercase. Words in italics are neither larger nor darker than their counterparts in a standard typeface, and yet italics are frequently used as a highlighting device. This, we suggest, is because the key lies in the disconfirmation of expectations and the corresponding trigger to go looking for meaning in that. When something is unexpected, it draws the reader's attention. And as Sperber and Wilson explain, there is no point in drawing someone's attention to a phenomenon unless it will seem relevant enough for him to be worth his attention. Now, for the rest of this presentation, I just want to quickly show a few examples to illustrate this and to build the case that while bigger and darker and stronger matter, expectations and context are crucial in the interpretation process. So first of all, I wanted to show you a quotation from a social media Microsoft researcher called Dana Boyd. Dana Boyd represents her name as you see on the screen there. So that's her Twitter profile. She spells her name, she represents her name with lowercase letters. That's how she has chosen to represent her name. It causes a lot of problems with editors when you have to cite her in the journal article. And I think the reason she gives for this is really interesting, because she says, I was always bothered by the fact that the first person singular pronoun is capitalized in English. I always thought it was quite self-righteous, and she makes the same point about capitalizing names. She's saying that by capitalizing I, which we normally do, we don't capitalize any other pronouns in English, but we capitalize I, kind of a strange thing to do, just a convention. And by capitalizing names, she's saying it's quite a self-righteous thing to do. And while I understand where she's coming from with this, and it's good to kind of question these conventions, I think what she unwittingly does here is kind of draw attention to herself, because her name stands out from lists and because it deviates from convention. We're expecting names to be capitalized, and almost every time I cite her work anywhere, I have to have a discussion with the editor about the fact that this is how she chooses to represent her name. And so while she thinks it's quite self-righteous to capitalize, she's actually drawing attention to herself by this process, this decision of hers. So a few examples to show how the expectations around what a text will look like on the page are sensitive to context, to genre, and to conventions. So if we look at an example from that's on the screen now, this is from Roxana by Daniel Defoe, we'll see that there are capitals in places that by today's standards we probably wouldn't expect there to be. So I have given you the whole detail of the story. Both detail and story are capitalized here. Now, this was obviously written at a time before the contemporary conventions around capitalization were established, and it's been suggested that the capitalization in Defoe is random, but if it were truly random, then we would expect to see maybe words like the and to and it, function words, also sometimes receive capitalization. But this doesn't seem to be the case. The words that are represented with an initial letter capitalized are nouns, verbs, and adjectives. And we can assume that Defoe, or perhaps more realistically, the typesetter who put this together, intended there to be some kind of salience afforded to these particular words. So we need to interpret the typography here against the conventions, or lack of the day and of the context in which this text was produced. This is quite an example that I just like to include. It's from a park near where I live. This is not from the time of Daniel Defoe, but still the person who has created, commissioned, signed off this public sign has decided that the words pigeons and rats should be capitalized in this particular sign, but they have not decided that encourages should be capitalized, or area here. So it's not completely clear what's going on, but and clearly it's not following any sort of very standard conventions that we currently have, but I also don't think it's random. At some point, somebody creating this sign thought we need to really pull the reader's attention to pigeons and rats. Whether they consciously thought that or not doesn't really matter. They ended up creating this representation of the instruction. Expectations can be text specific. So consider this example. It's a screenshot from a website for a London college. The same text is also printed on the banner outside the building itself, or at least it was. And this is in, first of all, the whole headline is in capitals, the academic sixth form for independent thinkers. But notice that at some point, somebody said, well, we don't want it to just be the academic sixth form. What we want the person reading this to think is that this is the academic sixth form for independent thinkers. But they probably then reached a bit of a dilemma, right? Because they've already put it in capital letters. They want the whole thing to stand out. So this is where we get back to this idea of this suprasegmental layering on of kind of emphasis and salience. So what they've done is they've gone, okay, well, we've got everything in capitals, so we'll make that word the stand out by having it in italics and in capitals. And they've done that to kind of create this extra effect and to encourage this interpretation. So once they created the headlines, capitals themselves were expected, and so to create that extra layer they had to add something else on, deviate from what had been established as the convention for this headline, and they did that by putting that one word into italics. A couple of more interesting examples here, again where we have texts that are all in block capitals, but the writer or somebody at some point has gone through and said, okay, I want particular words within this text to stand out, and they've had to resort to underlining or bolding in order to make them stand out, because the text itself had already established the convention of being in uppercase. And one more example here, this person had clearly written and not particularly happy note, and they'd done it in block capitals, perhaps to stress how important it is, and then they decided they had to add that extra layer of underlining to the word not, to again add an extra layer of focus and emphasis to that particular word. It's interesting that thank you is in lowercase, and that we almost read that as a kind of aside. Please do not use the toilet brush holder as a bin. Thank you. And the very last example that I want to show you is the example that sparked off my interest in all of this in the first place. This is an advert for a brand of drink that I noticed on the London Underground, on the platform. And I still don't understand what the designers behind this were trying to achieve. I mean, let's forget the fact that there's a million different things going on in this anyway. I'm sure the graphic designers out there can give me some feedback on that. But what I'm kind of most interested in is what's going on with the text in the slogan at the bottom, great drinks are yours for the making. They've created this in capitals and in bold, and then they've done this kind of odd thing with the, where they've made it lighter and made it stand out. And for me, that makes me want to say great drinks are yours for the making, but I don't understand what that means. And I think what they're perhaps trying to do is create a dual sentence here. So great drinks are yours for making, and great drinks are yours for the making, and that the is kind of can come or go. I don't know. But what it does is it makes the stand out, even though it's lighter and less heavy on the page. It stands out because it's different. It stands out as different from the rest of the sentence. Yeah, I still don't really know. I'd be interested to know your thoughts. I did email the company and the ad agency behind this to ask them, but I didn't get any reply. Thank you for your patience listening to me. There are my references. Thank you very much.